The irony in this debate is that gay people couldn't really change marriage. Heterosexual people had already changed it before gay people were able to even think about getting married. And that was something that happened long before parliaments in Europe were even thinking about giving gay couples rights. What we've seen over time, historians who look across cultures and way back in time tell us that marriage has had lots of different reasons and components to it, and those change. Some are emphasized at different points in time. In a more modern sense, we've seen recently that marriages have changed in the sense that they don't necessarily last for a lifetime anymore. Partly that's because people live a lot longer. Partly that's because divorce has become more easier, both in terms of the legal requirements for it and in terms of the lessening social stigma of divorce. And how people act in marriages has changed quite a bit. The very strict roles that once existed for wives and for husbands based on gender, one person being a woman and one person being a man, those have started to change quite a bit. Women are much more likely to participate in families, not just in taking care of kids, but also in being wage earners. Men are not just wage earners anymore, but their wives expect them to help out with the kids. And we see this over and over again, both in terms of the actual patterns that we can measure in pretty direct data, more women working, more men participating in housework. We see this in the attitudes that people have about what the correct roles for men and women are, for what they think a good marriage is. In the Netherlands, the heterosexual peers of the people I interviewed, when they've been surveyed, they say that basically having a child is not the most important aspect of marriage, but having a relationship that's shared, where the family roles in life are shared, family duties in life are shared. So marriage is something quite different now. I mean, what people say they want in surveys and what I heard in the interviews that I did suggested that people are interested in marriage because it's about love and commitment. It's about an interpersonal relationship between two people who are sharing their lives, perhaps raising children, but not necessarily. That's not necessarily the most important thing according to these surveys and the couples that I talked to. So it's a common modern view of marriage. Of course, that's quite a different view from what we saw 50 years ago, 100 years ago, where marriage was much more, in many cases, an economic decision, or the joining of families. It may have been something that had very different implications for the people who got married, and mainly for women, it didn't turn out to always be a very good deal in an economic sense. Women, until relatively recently, didn't have the right to own property in many countries if they were married. If their marriage ended, they were in deep trouble. They wouldn't necessarily have the ability to support themselves or to have any claim on their former husbands. They wouldn't necessarily get custody of their children. And in many cases, they wouldn't be given custody of the children at all because it was presumed that the father should keep the children. Over time, through the resistance of feminists mainly, there has been a very large change in marriage law in the United States and in Western Europe and many other countries that brings men and women, that has brought men and women up to being at a very equal place in the context of marriage. And now, in many places, pretty much the only gender-related distinction that you see in marriage anymore is in terms of who you can marry. You can't marry someone of the same sex in most places. So that brings us back to, the question of gay people getting married. I think gay people would not have wanted to get married had heterosexual people not already changed marriage. So I think that's maybe the closest connection between those two changes, but it's not that gay people have changed marriage, it's that heterosexual people already did that.
The discrimination against people who are sexual and gender minorities happens both within the person and in all of the multiple influences upon the person's life, what you could call societal discrimination or stigma. But ultimately, as I encounter these things and think about them, it comes down to what is the information we have, and what is the knowledge of people who make the laws, you know, carry out the laws and provide health care and make sure that people are prepared to deal with folks who are different from them. These are hugely challenging issues. Internalization of negative feelings about oneself leads to mental health problems, are strongly associated. The reasons that we have why we believe we have higher rates of depression and anxiety within our communities. An example of this that I think makes it very clear is what's happening to transgender people in this country, who are the most devastatingly affected population groups within our communities. I think denial of the right to marry has a direct relationship on how LGBT people form relationships, how we feel about ourselves, and on our mental and physical health. And I would approach it in this way. When you're denied a basic right that everyone else has, and you're denied that right because of a characteristic that's very critical to how you define yourself and how you live your life, it's almost impossible not to feel that in some way you're not okay. It's also very difficult not to be angry about these things. And we have very recently from our Secretary of Health and Human Services, Dr. Sebelius, make a statement to the country that this has to stop, that this endangers the lives of young people, and this is being done to LGBT people, to LGBT youth, specifically because of their difference. So yes, there's, I think, a direct relationship between this prejudice and discrimination that's done, and now these attacks on children. We have some very good research that addresses this, how the minority stress model that has been studied in other people has particular impact or relevance for LGBT populations. And all of these things that we are mentioning, or many of them, have been shown through good research to have an accumulative effect or an additive effect upon the mental health and the health of LGBT people. It's this additive stress, or the wearing down, you could even say the exhaustion in a person's life, that comes from day after day having to live with a part of yourself that as you are older you're more and more confident about, and you more and more experience, but in situations in which other people you know feel and may act against you if they learn this about you. It's not a good thing. Minority stress is a very negative, sort of socially driven experience that adds to the day-to-day stress that all of us have to face just from being alive. It's not fair, and it should be addressed.
One of the things we learned in the 2000 census is that there are children being raised by same-sex parents in 96% of the counties in the United States. So this is not a phenomenon that is rare anymore, and I think kids are starting to learn that there are lots of different kinds of families. There are blended families, adoptive families, cross-racial families, and families with same-sex parents. There's no evidence that there's any harm that comes to children by being raised by either by two women or by two men or by a person of homosexual versus heterosexual orientation. There's just no evidence that suggests that either sexual orientation or having parents of the same gender is detrimental to children. There are psychologists and social workers and educators and pediatricians and many different disciplines that would all concur that it makes no difference, that families are more or less ideal based on many different characteristics, but that one of those characteristics is not what their gender is or what their sexual orientation is. Statistically speaking, because lesbian and gay couples can't become parents by accident, the populations of children being raised by gay and lesbian couples are likely to be brought up in a more ideal environment or be brought into life, into the family, in a more ideal way than the total population of heterosexual couple families. So there are a lot of implications for this body of research on public policy. It's very clear that so many children need homes, both foster homes and permanent homes through adoption. The other thing that's very, very important for legislators and judges and just generally opinion leaders and policymakers to know is that children thrive best when they're in a nurturing, loving, and permanent and secure environment. So insofar as what we want to do in our society and in every society is to have children who thrive, civil marriage is a useful vehicle to that end. So I would love to have legislators and judges and the governmental system understand that it's not in the best interests of children to forbid their parents from maintaining a permanent and secure relationship.
Opponents of equality in marriage, adoption, and foster care have alleged for decades that there are no longitudinal studies demonstrating that children reared by same-sex parents are doing well. The fact is that I have been conducting this study for now 24 years, and we have irrefutable evidence that children growing up in lesbian parent households are doing just fine. So much of public policy, so much of the conflicts around legislation concerning adoption, foster care, and same-sex marriage relate to this supposed concern about the well-being of children raised by same-sex parents. This turns out not to be an issue, and I'm hoping that the results of our study will be used to discredit the allegations in so many public records that there is a problem with the concept of raising children by two parents of the same gender. There's absolutely no evidence to support that. And now that we have our study, which has been going on for 24 years, and the strength of this study with 93% of the families still participating in this study after all that time, with the results of our study published in highly prestigious, peer-reviewed journal. It's a terrible tragedy that there are so many children in need of adoption and foster care in the United States, and that there are many places where same-sex parents or individual lesbian or gay people are not allowed to adopt. The rules and laws against allowing same-sex parents and lesbian and gay individuals to adopt are based on nothing more than assertion that same-sex parents or lesbian and gay people can't be good parents. Our study provides irrefutable evidence that lesbian parents produce healthy, happy, high-functioning children. There's absolutely no justification for denying children in need of adoption or foster care loving homes based on the sexual orientation of their parents.
A very important role that social science research can play in formulating public policy is to provide accurate, factual information. And here I want to make a distinction between facts and values. As a social scientist, I really have no role in telling you what your personal beliefs and values should be, whether you personally are accepting of gay and lesbian individuals, whether you support same-sex marriage or not, or in contrast, whether you think homosexuality is immoral and you strongly oppose same-sex marriage. Those are your values. But what I can do as a social science researcher, and what I think I have an obligation to do, is to lay out the best available evidence about the true nature of same-sex couples and their relationships. There are many negative ideas in American society about homosexuality and same-sex couples, and social science has an important part to play in testing those ideas. In the 1950s and 60s, many Americans believed that lesbians and gay men were suffering from some form of mental illness, that homosexuality was a form of pathology. Based on growing research evidence, professional organizations came to the consensus opinion that that was absolutely not true. And over time, that view equating homosexuality and psychopathology has diminished in American society. More recently, researchers have examined some of the stereotypes about same-sex couples. And I think there are three important stereotypes that have been looked at. One is the idea that same-sex couples can't form happy, satisfying relationships based on love and commitment. Research has shown that this is absolutely not the case, that same-sex couples' relationships are not in any way, in general, inferior to those of heterosexuals, that on average these relationships are very similar. Second, stereotypes suggest that same-sex couples form relationships that are short-lived and don't last very long. That too turns out not to be true. Research has documented that many same-sex couples form relationships that last years and years and years. And finally, a third belief has been that somehow the processes that affect the well-being of same-sex couples and heterosexual couples are different, that the factors that make a difference in these relationships, whether they're happy, whether they stay together, somehow don't work the same for gay couples as they do for heterosexual couples. And that too turns out to be without foundation. It's not the case. Here again, we found great similarities. So I think a major way in which social science contributes both to educating voters and to providing information for policymakers is to provide the absolutely best available, up-to-date information about the realities of same-sex couples and the lives of lesbians and gay men.